The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. And now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. The Ninevites believed God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. When Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he issued in Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink, but let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. John Quincy Adams, whose father was John Adams, one of the founding fathers of our country, said, "The hope of a Christian is inseparable from his faith. Whoever believes in the divine inspiration of Holy Scriptures must hope that the religion of Jesus shall prevail throughout the earth." In other words, it's almost like he's saying, as Christians, we want Jesus to win, right? And I think each and every one of us do want Jesus to win, emphatically. November the 8th is coming up. November the 8th is a day for the midterm elections, and I think John Quincy's father, John Adams, would be like, hey, go vote, because I've experienced absolute power under a monarchy. We don't want you to go through that. I think it would be good to celebrate your right to vote, to practice it, to honor those who have given their lives. But I wonder, in voting, have you ever been disheartened? After you voted, have you ever been disheartened by the results, even if you got someone you want? Just asking. To be honest, there are times when we are disheartened, and the reason for that is because there are two worlds battling within each and every one of us. Our country's problem is not really a voting problem. Our country's problem is a culture problem. We are Christians whose culture comes from up above, living in a world whose culture comes from down below. And when we use worldly methods from down below in hopes of getting heavenly results from up above, we're probably going to be disappointed every time. Because even if we do get the people we want in power, there's a glaring problem. They're not Jesus. And even if they do a good job, they've got a shelf life. They'll be gone after a while. Someone will take their place. You and I think, yearn for this world to become better, yes? And what we find from Scripture about cultural change in the book of Acts is that cultural change occurs without a ballot box. If we Christians want to continue as Christians loving God and doing His will, then like Jonah, we have to remember God's will often does not go along with ours. While it is important to vote, and I hope you don't hear me saying don't vote, know this, that it is a worldly practice developed by men. So in Jonah's 3rd chapter, if you look here, First of all, look at chapter 1. Chapter 1, we have Jonah running away from God, right? And then he is thrown overboard. He is swallowed by a large fish. And in chapter 2, we see his reflection on the entire process. He says summatively at the end in verse 9, "What I have vowed I will make good. I will say salvation comes from the Lord." In other words, I'm going to start acting like a prophet. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. In Jonah chapter 3, which is where we're at today, we see this very simple message. Nineveh is saved because Jonah fulfilled God's will obediently. Doesn't mean he necessarily likes the outcome. We'll see that next week. Let's go ahead and take a look at chapter 3. First of all, we see the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. And we see that he does not take that for granted this time, does he? Because there in verse 3, what's it say? Jonah obeyed. He did what he was supposed to. He went a day's travel into the heart of the city of Nineveh, a very large city, and he said, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. Now, historians, they agree on the size and scope of Nineveh. It was considered large even by modern ideas. It was about 120,000 people living in a city that was longer than it was wide, and it was 7.5 miles long. To give you some perspective, Amarillo from north to south loop is about there. It's 5 miles in length. This is a large city back then, very outspread within that. And so Jonah goes a whole day's journey into the heart of the city, and he gets up on a box and he starts to proclaim the message. And what happens? Verse 5. The Ninevites believed God. And we see something amazing occur. Eventually, their belief makes it all the way up to the throne room there in Nineveh. And we see in verse 6, check this out. The king rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. It would be wonderful to see our modern leadership in any way, form, or fashion have that kind of humility. I don't think it's going to happen. Not until Jesus returns. You know, one of the amazing things we see here is it kind of reads, if you look at verse 5, it says, a fast was proclaimed. We see that proclamation in verse 7. It says, this is the proclamation this king then ordered. Check this out. He says, by the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink. Pizza's out. No tea, no water, you get nothing. And so the guards go around making sure all the marketplaces, the Uniteds, the Walmarts, they're all shut down. And he says, but let people and animals be covered in sackcloth. Now, sackcloth is this clothing that's made out of goat hair. It's very, very itchy. And so they felt the pain of the moment. And generally speaking, in the Middle East, the sackcloth was worn whenever they were grieving, let's say, someone dying whom they loved. They would grieve. It would be like us walking out of the door here in Amarillo and seeing everyone wearing funeral clothes. And all the kids just, it itches so bad. But it's not about someone dying. It's about the grief of the moment, the sin that has separated people from God. And by the way, if anyone dresses their little cute animals in clothes from time to time, you got scriptural precedent right here for it. Did you notice that? They dress their animals. Can you imagine seeing the horses, the donkeys, the dogs, all dressed up in sackcloth? Everyone was grieving, wanting the thing to come off, knowing what was going on, truly believing in God, and praying fervently to God. And I love the king's humility. Verse 9. Who knows, he says. God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. I can't control it. But maybe God will. Maybe He'll relent. And we see the effect of this. Verse 10. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, He relented and did not bring on them the destruction He had threatened. And so what do we see? Nineveh is saved because Jonah fulfilled God's will obediently. Nathan, are you saying that we can have this kind of effect in the United States where everybody goes out, fasts, and has sackcloth, and everything turns around? No. In fact, Christ says, small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. And so, according to Christ, Christians will be a minority. And the lives we experience here on this earth reflect that tragic outcome. Now, as I read this story, I'm sitting here reading this. This is starting back at chapter 1 through chapter 3. And then I get to chapter 3, and I realized every time I kept imagining, when I saw the words Nineveh, the United States of America. Every time. Because like Nineveh, the United States of America does have an idolatry problem. I mean, you think about Buddhism and the idols there. You think about the idols with Hinduism and other religions. But then you start to think about the big, pervasive kind of idolatry we have in the United States. The idolatry of ideals. For example, sexuality has become idolized in the United States. You can see that with the pornography industry, with how sexuality is affecting legislation and many other ways in education. We see that with race. Race has become something that is idolized. But if we're honest with ourselves, as Americans, we need to understand that sometimes we also idolize some of our American rights. I heard a famous person recently about something else we idolize say, sometimes the things we own us. You ever heard that? How many of y'all, first thing you do in the morning is get on your cell phone? And the last thing you do at night is get on your cell phone. Don't you think it would be better if the first thing we did was prayer and the last thing we did was prayer? I'll tell you what, I say this as a hypocrite. I use my phone too much. I'm on it too much. And I could be spending a lot more time with God in many different ways. Sometimes our things own us. But not only do we have an idolatry problem here in the United States, we have a violence problem. I was reading some studies from a group called the Brennan Center. They said crime rates across the U.S. in 2020 rose significantly. Specifically, murder rate has risen by nearly 30% in the United States. Violent crime, assaults, has gone up by 10% as a total. And I was like, surely not an Amarillo. Ha! No, not Amarillo, not here in the Panhandle. We're in the Bible Belt. We are not becoming more violent, right? I looked it up. Yes, I'll share it with you. Amarillo's homicide rate increased in 2020 by 12.5%, and overall violent crimes each year since then have gone up by 13%, which would also include murder rate. Amarillo's becoming more violent too. We might ask ourselves, why is it that our country seems to be devolving, going further down and towards this world culture and further away from a kingdom culture? My friend Leonard and I were having a conversation this week. He'll tell you that he saw an interview where they said the majority of the United States will not be Christian by 2025. And I read an article from Christianity Today that said the same thing by 2030. Let's make it an average, 2027. There's a disconnect that occurs between God's people and the world we live in. More people are choosing to wade in the muck of a hypersexualized, violent, and idolatrous culture than used to. There is no doubt about it. But can I tell you some good news? I would love to tell you some good news right now, and you're probably thinking, oh, this is so dire. Tell me some good news. I'll give you some great news. Here it is. We don't hope in what we can do. We hope in what God has done and will do and can do based on what He has done. The presentation of the gospel has melted hearts, and everyone who's in this room is evidence that that is the case and that individuals and groups can change. And it's our job as Christians to present second culture. There are two cultures, the kingdom of God and the world, side by side. And we want to give it to them in the best way we can so that when they see it, they make the best educated guess that they can. How many of y'all text message? Real high. That's okay. There's no shame in it. The texting is a thing. Good. All right. There was this poor mother who had just started text messaging. And so she text messages her son for the first time some bad news. She says, "Your great aunt just passed away. LOL." Yeah. He texted back, "Why is that funny?" She said, "It's not funny, David. What do you mean?" He says, "Mom, LOL means laughing out loud." She says, "Oh my goodness. I sent that to everyone. I thought it meant lots of love. I have to call everybody back." Everybody's gotten this message from this poor lady, and she says, "This person died, LOL." They're all thinking, oh my goodness. Now, was that the problem of the phone? No, it didn't make a mistake. In fact, this is one of the first times where the problem was not autocorrect. I hate autocorrect. I will not even go into detail of the things that I've said, not meant to say. That was not the issue. Her issue was she didn't know what something meant. So the issue was user error. That's our problem as ambassadors of Christ who have scriptures, who have the gospel, who know what we're supposed to do, and we have user error, malfunction. You see, we seek justice, we seek change, and we look to the ballot box and those elected to do that change. But without constantly doing our job as Christians and constantly discipling people, making the culture better, the ballot box only empowers the practice of the majority of a non-Christian group. You see, true cultural change comes from being an ambassador of Jesus Christ, living for Jesus, telling the world about Jesus. And in Jonah chapter 3, we see a lesson that I'd like to modernize for you. Since I doubt we can admit that kind of change, we can still do it this way. We can maximize the chance of people being changed by fulfilling God's will obediently and doing so appropriately. All right, so Jonah obeyed, right? He obeyed the word of the Lord. He goes a day into the city, a place where he knows they torture people, that if they don't like the message, they can rip his arms off, they can put him in a cast iron bull, they'll do whatever they want. He goes into this town and he says a message which all these people hear, and it contrasts with the way they live life. They see there's a contrast between the way they live life and what God wants of them, and something occurs because of Jonah's obedience. They change. Obedience, Anna Street, is a requirement. It is necessity. Jesus says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." Our obedience to Jesus is necessary because it directly relates to how we are seen in a world that is not, in fact, obedient to Christ. If the kingdom culture is side by side with the world's culture, and they see a kingdom culture who just does everything the same, will anything change? No. If they see a kingdom culture side by side with the world's culture, and they see people who would like the distance to be a lot further and not have anything to do with them and just hurl judgments at them, will anything change? No. Jesus calls us to be salt and light in a flavorless and dark world, and like Jonah's message, our light and our flavor are supposed to contrast. And we do just that when we are obedient to Jesus, who tells us, help those who are in need, love your neighbors, or make disciples. Teach them to obey me. Benjamin Franklin, one of the forefathers, this is what he said during his time. Check this out. He says, how many observe Christ's birthday? How few his precepts. You see, we are living the consequences of our culture continually living that way. Celebrating the birth of Christ and never following anything that miraculous baby who died for us said to do. If we are going to maximize the opportunity for change in our world, we must start by fulfilling God's will, being obedient to Jesus. But it's not only that, it's in the appropriate nature in that we do it. We have to do it appropriately, right? Normally, this is where I would say, be nice to people, right? Steve gave us a great lesson last week, and he said, yeah, one of the worst things we could do is be like that guy who gets up on the corner and with the megaphone and just tells people, either do this or go to hell. That's not a good way to do it. That's not very appropriate. We love our neighbors. We help those. So what do I mean by appropriate? Jonah goes a day's journey in and he starts to speak. Does he go up to the king? Does he go knock on the door and walk up to the 5th floor and say, I got a bone to pick with you? Does he pop out and say, we need to have a vote? No. He begins to speak, and the people around him in his vicinity start to listen. And like dropping a pebble in a pond, the ripples go outward, affecting everyone, until finally the king has no option except to say, what's going down in the marketplace? Why is nobody doing anything? Well, there's this guy saying this, and then he believes. And then he makes a proclamation. That is the model that we see in the Bible. I would say that it's bottom up and then top down. Bottom up and then top down. We even see that in the New Testament and further beyond that. You see, the early church was different. They taught, they preached in Acts, and they created churches, and as they're creating churches, they are changing the cultures and the communities the churches are within. Tim Keller says this, the pagan society was stingy with its money and promiscuous with its body. A pagan gave nobody their money and practically everyone their body. The Christian came along and gave practically nobody their body and everyone their money. In other words, unlike the community around them, they were not sexually promiscuous. Unlike the world around them, they used their money to help their neighbors. And this different way of living life had a powerful effect. 220 years later, when the Emperor of Rome, Constantine, made Christianity the religion of the same country that crucified its founder. Bottom up, top down. This is the model that our culture should be taking on as Christians today, but sometimes we get overly zealous about the top down. Top down, top down, top down, and we forget it's about relationships. You cannot do the top down and not have relationships and not serve and not help people and not teach people. We forget about the ambassador's job, which is to have good relationships and to share Christ. This translates to having relationships with people and having that contrast that we need. Now, once again, I want to say, before you walk out of here, he told us not to vote. I didn't say that. I want you to have a realistic spiritual understanding of that. It does not substitute for the obedience Jesus Christ calls us into. John says, and it's... I thought this was great. Sometimes you plan things, sometimes you don't. You look at the front of your bulletin right there. John says, the world and its desires pass away, but whatever man does the will of God lives forever. It's right there. Please go out to vote, but know that ballot box will be gone. Politicians will be gone. When Christ returns, there's no need to vote. We will be transitioned from a human fallen democracy into a monarchy that no one has ever experienced before. And the Lamb will be on the throne. He will be king. So in summary, we need to maximize the opportunity for the world around us to change. We do that through fulfilling God's will obediently and doing it appropriately through relationships first and foremost. So the question before you is simple, 2 words. Will you? Will you hear the message and go forth obeying Christ, helping those in need, serving others, discipling and teaching? Or will you just say, I'll just vote? Or nothing. Some people do not want to accept the fact that change is needed. Just understand. Some people don't understand the fact change is needed. I heard a story about a doctor who told a man who's having heart issues, he said, you need to give up red meat. The guy said, fine. I'll just take ketchup off my hamburger. He died another month later. If you're like me and you see a world which is messed up, and it is, and you're seeking society to change, remember, to emit true change, you first truly must change. That's the truth. We must accept our differing role in this world, being ambassadors for the King who is coming. There was a guy by the name of Ernest Blandy. You ever heard that name? Perfect. He was not known for much, except for the song you're about to sing. He worked with the Salvation Army, but when he really got big was when he decided to become a preacher. And they gave him a choice between 2 churches. One was in New York City, a really ritzy part of New York City. The other one was in the slums in then Hell's Kitchen. It was overcrowded, it was inhabited by gangs, and there were law-breaking citizens that was their way of life. And so it was an easy choice for him, right? I mean, what would you choose? It was an easy choice for him because he believed that he heard his Savior calling, and he chose the slums. He chose the difficult path. He chose the one less traveled. He chose the narrow gate, the one where he picked up his cross and he followed Jesus. So as we stand here in a moment to sing this song, this invitation song that he wrote, I ask you to prayerfully make sure you put the American way second, and that you put Christ and the ambassadorship He calls you to first.